Earlier this week, one of San Diego's biggest tech companies faced a major setback. Apple announced it may not use Qualcomm's technology in future iterations of the iPhone. This has been the latest in a series of legal fights between the two tech giants. Monday's announcement sent Qualcomm stocks tumbling by 7%, and eyes shifted toward two other companies, Intel and MediaTek, that provide similar technology. Here's the rundown.
Apple's getting ready to drop Qualcomm's chips, sources tell Reuters. It has designed its iPhones and iPads to be able to stop using Qualcomm semiconductors. Qualcomm shares plunged on the news. Shares of Intel, which analysts say would benefit the most if Apple switches vendors, rose to a 17-year high. Apple's move comes after Qualcomm withdrew a testing software Apple was using for Qualcomm chips. The two companies are also locked in a multinational legal dispute over Qualcomm's licensing terms to Apple. Chase Bank chief economist Anthony Chan.
If you look at a company like Apple over time, they're going to be working with different partners over time and certainly always try to use the partners that create the best possible product. So any changes that a company like Apple makes over time should not be surprising to anyone. They're just trying to deliver the best possible product for consumers.
The change, if it happens, would affect iPhones released in the fall of 2018. Sources at Apple could still keep Qualcomm on its supplier list.
The controversy is rooted in the next level of smartphone technology, 5G, which Qualcomm has successfully tested in San Diego. Additionally, on Friday, the Singaporean company Broadcom took a bid to acquire Qualcomm, which would be a massive merger that could be the largest in the semiconductor industry. Broadcom is another Apple supplier too, and they've been eyeing moving their headquarters back to the US. The deal is under review, and my conversation with tech reporter Mike Freeman occurred before this late-breaking news. Let's learn more about this tech kerfuffle. I'm Daniel Wheaton, and this is Refocus. Mike Freeman, why don't you start with the basics? What are some of the technologies that Qualcomm provides in our smartphones?
Qualcomm provides a lot of technologies in the smartphone. So they do the application processor, which is kind of like a CPU in a computer. They do the graphics processor, which again renders images on the screen. The digital signal processor, which processes a lot of the signals that are coming in from the wireless network. And then the component that's kind of subject of their dispute with Apple is called the cellular modem, which is kind of a data link that connects the smartphone to the cellular towers in the wider cellular network, and does so in a way that uses airwaves very efficiently. That's kind of their secret sauce. So think of it as like an FM AM dial. So Qualcomm's chip, when signals are coming from the cell tower to the smartphone and vice versa, looks for the best AM FM signal, the strongest one, has a code that moves the signal around to different frequencies to get the signal to your phone fast with a high data rate. Essentially allows you to do internet surfing and stream video on your device.
Yeah, so essentially it's what makes your smartphone smart in a way.
In a way, yeah. They would argue that, without cellular connectivity, you would, it's basically a glorified iPod Touch. But there's other connectivity to the phone, frankly. I mean, Wi-Fi is a connectivity that is not cellular. So, that's reaching a bit, but that is what Qualcomm would argue.
This controversy between Apple and Qualcomm has been going on for quite some time. Could you give us kind of what we need to know to understand about what's happening this week?
Well, what happened this week is a little bit fuzzy in the wider context of what is going on. So why don't I start with kind of what is going on? These two have been arguing or in a dispute over patent licensing. Qualcomm has two businesses. One that makes these chips that go into phones, but it also invents technologies. And those technologies are related to that chip that goes into the phone, but other people can make chips and use this same technology that they invented and produce chips themselves that competitors can use. So Qualcomm licenses that technology. It's kind of a patent licensing business model, and Apple contends that Qualcomm has been overcharging for years for its patented technology. And because it had such a strong lead in these modem chips, it could produce ones that were way faster than the competitors, that, smartphone makers had, especially smartphone makers like Apple, who make very high-end devices. They're not making a bunch of $200 phones. They're making $900 phones. Said, listen, we need your chips. Therefore, we can't argue with you over these patent fees. And you're leveraging this, chip monopoly at the high end and your chip prowess to make us overpay for your intellectual property. Not fair. And so they filed their, a long story short, there was some machinations of, we're not going to pay you this and we're not going to pay you that, and on and on and on. And they ended up suing each other over essentially that. Again, Apple believes that they've been overpaying for use of Qualcomm's intellectual property. And it could be argued that Apple has argued this a bit, that, listen, Qualcomm's business model is weird. If you buy a modem chip for most people, or another chip for most people, the cost of the IP is included in that. So the price you pay for the chip also includes the intellectual property. Qualcomm separates those out, in part because it has a lot of different intellectual property. It's not just about the cellular modem and this chip. It does power management. It does airplane mode. It does GPS. It does a whole bunch of stuff. It's got, I guess, active patents. It's got 130,000 patents in its portfolio. It's got about 80,000 that are really kind of active and related to smartphones. That's a huge patent portfolio. And so, they say, hey, listen, when you get our patents, license our patents, you're getting all that. Not just this chip. But Apple, Apple doesn't like it. Apple would like to see the business model where the price of the IP is included in the chip. When you sell a chip to them, you don't then pay a separate patent license to somebody. And that is kind of another kind of crux in this argument that's going on between the two.
Yeah, and so that's why Apple has been looking to other manufacturers of similar chips, correct?
Yes. So two things here, which are kind of sometimes get lost in the translation. In 2011, Apple, when iPhones first came out from 2007 to 2010, let's say, they were pretty exclusive on AT&T. They didn't use a Qualcomm chip. They used from a company called Infineon, which Intel eventually bought. And so, there was no real relationship there. In around 2010, though, Qualcomm did something. It invested heavily in 4G LTE, which really increased the data rates that you could get on your smartphone, really increased the internet speeds. And then Apple, had done well with the iPhone and wanted to get on Verizon's and Sprint's networks, and even T-Mobile's, which they weren't on prior. They were just on AT&T. So they went in and reached an agreement where they started using Qualcomm's chips. And because Qualcomm was like way ahead of everybody else in 4G, they only used Qualcomm's chips. And then in 2015, late 2015, for the 2016, I think, release of iPhone 7, Intel caught up good enough. They're not as good, but they caught up good enough. So Apple, who does not like to be beholden to one supplier for any part, and really has a different view of how it supplies parts to its iPhone, in that it says, listen, we can give you so much volume and so much cachet by being an iPhone supplier that you really shouldn't make a profit on us, right? When you sell this stuff to us, it should be at a very low profit margin, and we'll dictate that margin to you. It's going to be very low because, we're going to give you so much volume that you're going to do great. And, you got the cachet of being an iPhone supplier, and that means others are going to hire you. So when you have that sort of dynamic, Qualcomm wasn't having any of that. They, they worked with them, but, they basically said, go find somebody else. And they did when Intel caught up. And so they split half and half, essentially with the iPhone 7. And I think that continues to this day, split half and half. So the iPhones that are on AT&T and T-Mobile in the US and in Europe use Intel's chips. And the ones that are on Sprint, Verizon, and quite a few of the China operators use Qualcomm's modem chips.
Yeah, it's really interesting because over that time span that you explained, that's when we saw the explosion of smartphones on the market. So in a sense, Apple and Qualcomm benefited greatly from this. So it kind of makes sense why there's that tension that still exists today.
Yeah, and both of them. I mean, so there was what analysts like to call a super cycle of iPhone upgrades and iPhone dominance that kind of started when they started getting 4G in their phones, and really Qualcomm provided the 4G. So it was a really mutually beneficial relationship. And to understand why this all might be happening now is also interesting in that, beyond the fact that Intel could provide an alternative, and so they could dual source and get better deals. It's also smartphone growth has slowed now. So they're not, selling 25% more a year than they did for 5 years. And that means that, to continue to make profit margins on these devices, you have to worry about your component costs. And so Apple is good at that.
And this is also important because Qualcomm is looking to the next step, which is 5G. So why don't you first explain what that technology is? Because we're kind of used to the idea of like 3G versus 4G. What can 5G provide?
Okay, so this is interesting too. Every 10 years in the cellular business, about every 10, 15, they go to the next generation. So it started out, 1G, then a 2G, which was really what the first iPhone was, and then 3G, which gave us, pretty good internet connection, but not great. 4G gave us really good internet connections, pretty fast download speeds to your phone. 5G is even going to go farther than that, in that it will burn like maximum throughput. If there was nobody else on the network and you held your phone close to the cell tower, with 5G, potentially, you could get like 5 gigabits per second download speeds. That's beating fiber optics. It's wireless fiber optic speeds. It is really, really fast. Now, of course, cellular networks don't work like that, right? I mean, there's interference, there's other users and stuff, but we're talking, really fast. It will do that. The second thing it will do is there are, and people notice it, especially in long distance calls, a little delay, right, when you talk. 5G is going to get rid of that. And the reason it's going to get rid of it is because if you have a more like autonomous cars or medical devices connected wirelessly, you can't have a delay. If I'm walking across the street with my smartphone in my pocket and a guy runs a red light and the car is going to automatically stop, there can be no delay from when the phone hits the tower because somebody's going to get hit. So, I mean, this is the type of thing where it's called latency, and when they eliminate latency, they can do a lot more in terms of like autonomous cars, healthcare, wireless healthcare, and a lot of other things. And then it's just going to expand the pots because there are going to be so many devices connected. Everything is going to be connected. I'm trying to, when they talk about, connected refrigerators, these are the easy ones. Yeah. Connected refrigerators, but think about, connected, clothing where, you have a chip in your shirt that monitors your heart rate, is examining your sweat, all these health things that could happen. So it's just going to be a lot more things connected, and 5G is going to have a framework to do that. Okay. So 5G is coming. The lead will be these high-speed data rates. That's what people will get their eyes will get big with that. Qualcomm has been working on this for 10 years. Okay. So while everybody's catching up with 4G, Intel and others catching up with Qualcomm and 4G, even though Qualcomm has a lead, it's not as wide as it was. The question is, will they have that lead when 5G hits in 2019? Will they then do a, order of magnitude jump where they are so far ahead, 2 years, 3 years ahead of competitors in the technology? That's a question that is not answered yet. But if you look historically, they had a 4-year lead at one point in 4G. And then it got, incrementally went down. Now it might be 18 months they're ahead of their competitors. With 5G, if it comes in, Qualcomm could be a real leader there. And again, have a 4-year lead on what anybody else is doing. They've been doing research on this for a decade. And, the fact of the matter is they're a wireless invention company. Mm-hmm. They make chips to show off what they invented, but, and to monetize it, obviously. But, they are really an invention company. And so when you look at, others, at least Wall Street analysts believe that Qualcomm will come out if 5G ahead.
So in the end, for consumers, this essentially means the cost of whatever smartphones come out in the future is kind of determined by what happens, and also the functionality once that hits, correct?
For consumers, it's unclear of what all this is going to end up meaning.
Yeah, everything has to be settled in court, obviously.
Exactly. So, where the royalty rate ends up is anybody's guess at this point. But to give it some context, a iPhone 7 or 8 might sell for, Apple would sell that to, let's say, a carrier, or if you went into an Apple store and bought it, might sell for, $700, $800, depending on what your memory is on it. And for that, Qualcomm is getting paid by Apple about $10, $10 to $12 for its IP, for its intellectual property. It's not very much.
Yeah.
But Apple, where is the right number for Apple in this? Is it $4? Is it $6? There's a number there that these guys, might be able to come to an agreement on. But if it were me and I said to a consumer, okay, so Apple's going to reduce the bill of materials cost of its phone from $10 to $12 to $4 to $6. Is that really going to matter to me on a $700, $800 device?
It sounds negligible at that point.
And they may not ever see it.
Yeah.
Right? It might just float to Apple.
Yeah, which makes business sense. Like,
exactly.
If you're selling it for $700, why reduce the price?
Exactly. So I don't think that is the real risk to consumers. Now, what could happen is that the relationship between these two companies deteriorates to the point where they don't use each other anymore, which is kind of what the news was this week, that Apple was considering designing out Qualcomm's chips from its phones. And that wouldn't, kind of roll out until late 2018 when they do the next version, if they do the next version on the same cycles that they've been doing the current versions. But if that were the case, then, and they couldn't, mend fences and get a relationship, and Qualcomm did lead in 5G, then at some point in time, you're liable to see phones from competitors of Apple that have 5G, millimeter wave, gigabit LTE, multi-gigabit download speeds, and Apple doesn't. Now, for in a practical matter, that's really, really fast speeds, and there aren't a whole lot of applications now that really use that or want that. But maybe somebody comes up with something that needs that sort of high bandwidth, and that application becomes super popular, and that's kind of what drives those phone sales, right? Because they all kind of look the same, and so it's kind of a speculative risk for Apple in the future. For Qualcomm, they've already been hit by this financially. I mean, this thing, Apple is so big that they really haven't been hit, and probably won't be. But Qualcomm's already suffering financially, and it's a question, can they hold out? Do they want to, or are they going to kind of say, okay, $46, let's just get this over with, and move on? So, Apple is a big smartphone player in the U.S. and in Europe and in certain other countries. It's interesting to note that Qualcomm is, Apple is not as big in China, and Qualcomm is huge in China in terms of supplying those smartphone makers there. And it will be interesting to see at some point in the future here if those Chinese brands that most of us today don't know anything about, Oppo, Vivo, Xiaomi, others, start showing up in stores in the U.S. Because that would really be an interesting take on, Apple's decisions regarding the capabilities on its phone for, connectivity. So anyway, there's a lot going on for consumers. You're not going to see anything out of this for a couple of years. Other than, it's going to last for a couple of years. There's not going to be a lot of resolution, but there's going to be a lot of headlines. It's going to move some stocks, particularly Qualcomm's, because, again, Apple is insulated from this just for pure size. As a consumer, I wouldn't worry about it at this point in time. It's more, though, in that 2019 timeframe when new devices come out that potentially would have 5G or really super fast 4G modems. Then you might see a little bit of difference, and then we'll have to see if the market really cares. Yeah. Right? I mean, it's a headline number for geeks, right? My phone is plenty fast enough at the moment. Yeah. Somebody comes up with a super cool app, that maybe downloads or streams, high def Netflix in 2 seconds or something, or virtual reality. That's another thing that might be, really drive something like this. So let's think about this. If I saw a demo on this, if you can't get tickets to the national championship basketball game, but let's say you could virtual reality be as if you're sitting. You put your phone in your VR gear headset, and it is as if you are sitting courtside at the real national championship game. Okay, where you're watching them warm up, you're seeing the real players. That's the type of application that they're going to need a boatload of bandwidth to deliver to people. And that's the type of application, if it became popular and people could do that sort of thing, or be ringside at a big boxing match, anything kind of sports related is what I'm thinking of right now. But
those experiences.
Yeah, right.
Concerts too.
Concerts, right? Just to be like there, but you're doing it VR. Those are the type of things that really may drive future smartphone sales. And that's an application, again, that's going to need a lot of bandwidth. So those are the type of things in the future that may, drive consumers and drive these companies to settle their differences.
Well, Mike, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Refocus is a production of the San Diego Union-Tribune. This episode was produced by myself and Lauren Flynn. Please let us know how we did and rate and review us on iTunes. Until next time.